What's up, everybody? Thank you for checking into my channel. Matthew Everhard here. I'm the pastor of Gospel Fellowship PCA. Today we're going to look at Jonathan Edwards' unfinished masterpiece, and that would be his great work, A History of the Work of Redemption, which, if you know the works of Jonathan Edwards, the Yale editions, this would be volume 9. I have it here in hardback, but you can get it for free on the internet at edwards.yale.edu. All of Edwards' stuff is out there for free. And let me tell you this, too. While we're talking about Edwards for a moment, I have a huge playlist of Edwards-related videos on my YouTube channel. If you go over to my channel and just click down on the playlist, I've got 40 or something lectures on Jonathan Edwards that you might want to avail yourself to at some point. But in today's lecture, we're going to be talking about, again, his unfinished masterpiece, which would be his history of the work of redemption. If you're new to the channel, thanks for checking in. I'm also the adjunct professor at RPTS. That's the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh. Love to have you in class at some point, rpts.edu. And again, visit us at Gospel Fellowship PCA. We're a local Reformed Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh. If you're looking for a church like that, please come at some point and check us out. All right, well, let's get into the unfinished masterpiece here. Now, we're actually going to start at the end of Jonathan Edwards' life, because he says something about this work, his intention for it, that's really important. And this comes in the moment where Jonathan Edwards is going to send a letter to the trustees of the College of New Jersey, later to be called Princeton University, a Presbyterian theological seminary, which was designed to be the conservative option to Yale, which was conservative but slipping a bit, which was, again, the replacement for Harvard, which started off as a conservative theological seminary and went wayward as well, as things tend to do. Anyways, Princeton invites Jonathan Edwards to become their president after the death of Aaron Burr Sr., who was Jonathan Edwards' son-in-law. And Edwards at first is going to try to push pause on this. He's not sure that he should take up this kind of a call on his life. But what does he do? Well, he writes them a letter, and he says the following. He says, besides these other reasons, he's giving some reasons why he doesn't think he should do it, I have had my mind and heart, which I long ago began, not with any view to publication, a great work, which I call A History of the Work of Redemption, a body of divinity in an entire new method. Now, that's an interesting phrase, isn't it? An entirely new method. How is it a new method, we wonder? Being thrown into the form of a history, considering the affair of Christian theology in the whole of it, in each part, as it stands in reference to the great work of redemption by Jesus Christ, which I suppose is to be the grand design of all of God's designs, and the summum and ultimum of all of the divine operations in degrees, particularly considering all parts of the grand scheme in their historical order. So this is what Edwards is saying that he wants to do. He can't take the job, he says, because this body of divinity, this systematic theology, this biblical theology that he wants to write is going to be inhibitive to him taking up this particular call. He goes on. The order of their existence, or their being brought forth to view in the course of divine dispensations, or the wonderful series of successive acts and events beginning from eternity and descending from thence to the great work and successive dispensations of their infinitely wise God in time, considering the chief events coming to pass in the church of God and the revolutions in the world of mankind, affecting the state of the church and their affair of redemption, in which we have an account of in history or prophecy, till at last we come to the general resurrection, last judgment and consummation of all things, when it shall be said, it is done, I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. So this is Edwards' own description of what he hoped his book, A History of Redemption, would eventually become. Now, he'll say this too, concluding my work with the consideration of that perfect state of things which shall be finally settled to last for eternity. This history will be carried on with regard to all three worlds. Now, notice this here. This is interesting. Heaven, earth, and hell, considering the connected successive events and alterations in each so far as the scriptures give any light, introducing all parts of divinity and that order which is most scriptural and most natural, which is a method which appears to me the most beautiful and entertaining, wherein every divine doctrine will appear to greatest advantage in the brightest light in the most striking manner, showing the admirable contexture and harmony of the whole. Okay, so wow, that's like quite the description of what he's intending to write. And so it's no wonder then that Jonathan Edwards says, I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to take up this call as the president of what's going to become Princeton, New Jersey. I've got a lot to write. I've got a lot to do. And he certainly hopes to do that. Now, Unfortunately, Edwards has no idea that his own death is right around the corner because, as you and I know, as we think about the scope of Edwards' life, that he's only going to be the president of Princeton for a very short time. In fact, just a few months. He really barely begins the job of the presidency before he eventually dies. And so this work, A History of the Work of Redemption, which again I have right here in hardback and you have at edwards.yale.edu in volume 9, wasn't really the work that Edwards had hoped it would be. And so in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to take up this consideration here and try to figure out exactly what Edwards thought he was going to do and why it didn't come to completion. So let's start with this here. What do we have in this volume? Well, we have a series of sermons from 1739. In fact, we have 30 sermons in something like a rough biblical and theological order from one text, Isaiah chapter 51, verse 8. So Edwards is going to preach, and he does this in 1739. This is between the revivals. Remember, the local revival, 1734-35, and then the Great Awakening is going to be 1740 to 42. So this is right between that. He preaches 30 sermons. Can you imagine that? On one Bible verse. That's a lot of juice to squeeze out of one orange, right? But here's the orange. Isaiah 50, verse 8 says, "For the moth will eat them up like a garment, and the worm will eat them like wool, but my righteousness will be forever, and my salvation to all generations." So Edwards is going to preach on this text 30 times in a long series of sermons in which he's going to go through the work of redemption in something like a biblical order. Okay, we're going to see how that order pulls together here as we go through this. Now, interestingly, Isaiah 51:8, you wonder, how much can you get out of one verse? Well, if you go to his blank Bible, which is volume 24 in the works of Edwards, he really only has one comment on this verse. He says, this verse is a proof of the indestructibility of the church. Okay, is it? Is that what it says? Well, let's go back to it. "For the moth will eat them up like a garment, and the worm will eat them like wool, but my righteousness will be forever, and my salvation to all generations." Well, I guess that's what it means, right? Because again, look, he says, my righteousness will be forever, and my salvation to all generations. And so Edwards sees in this verse the idea that God is going to not only save Israel, he's going to save people out of the Old Testament, the saints out of the Old Testament, but he's also going to continue his work in the church as he saves people, of course, through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And God is going to do that. He's going to carry out his work of redemption when? To all of the generations here. And so this is what he thinks the interpretation is, that the church, the whole church, all of the saints, the invisible church, all the people of God, is therefore indestructible, and God is going to carry on his work throughout all of history. Okay? Now, when we look at this series of sermons, it's a little bit different from many of his other sermons, for sure. It's quite different, in fact, because we have 30 sermons from one text. That's not something that Jonathan Edwards does very often at all. Normally, Edwards preaches what we might call standalone sermons from one text, usually a Bible verse, and those sermons follow a very predictable order, something like this. There's first the text where he states what the meaning of the passage is, and most of the colonial Puritans understood their Bibles very well. There's going to be a statement of the doctrine in which Edwards is going to say the meaning of this text, and then he's going to spend a good half the sermon in application. Now, if I had to guess, and we've looked at some numbers here in previous videos, this text is about 10% of the sermon. This is going to be like 40%, and this is going to be like, I don't know, the other 40% or something like that, or 45 or whatever. But you get the idea. The text is the smallest portion, 10%. Or 20% maybe, and then we have larger portion of the doctrine, and then a very large portion that's application. Typically, Edwards would also re-preach his sermons at various times and in various places, like, for instance, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He preached not only at Northampton, but also at Enfield, where that great event, remarkably, about that sermon took place. Here, though, interestingly, Edwards never re-preaches these 30 sermons, and we do sort of wonder why. I guess it's because most of his re-preached sermons were good standalone sermons that he could take to different places, whereas this was obviously a full set. And he's really going to bend this traditional form because usually every sermon has text, doctrine, and application. But in this case, he's going to smooth all of those three pieces, text, doctrine, application, into the full 30 sermons because he does seem to have the intention here to write this into a large treatise, okay? So to some extent, there's a lot less of the improvement or the application, same concept here, in these particular sermons because he's going to save the application for certain of the sermons as he's going to go forward through this series. And again, we're going to look at the outline here, so this is going to make sense here in just a moment. Now, it's unusual for Edwards to do this kind of a sermon series because, again, most of his sermons were sort of standalone sermons. It's not that he never did sermon series, because we do have several other instances where he does. For instance, and here's something interesting, they're all between the revivals, okay? Okay, they're not all, but several of them are between the revivals, 34, 35, 40, 42, right? So he does a series of 17 sermons on the Matthean parables, specifically Matthew 25, 17 sermon units on one text, the parables. What is it? It's the parable of the virgins, the foolish virgins, I believe. Also, he does 16 sermons or so on what we call now charity and its fruits from 1 Corinthians 13. Interestingly, this series is really the only one that's what we might call an expository series through a section of a book of the Bible. He typically did not do, for instance, what John Calvin did in preaching through books of the Bible, but would typically take one text. Here, he takes a whole chapter and he works through it verse by verse. But in the History of Redemption series in 1739, it's going to be 30 preaching units from, again, one verse. Well, how could you get that much information from one verse? Well, here's the themes of his sermon series. And this is what he would have unfolded had he lived to be able to complete this magnum opus that he wanted to do. Certainly, he was going to show the centrality of redemption in terms of history. He was going to show how typology points to the person and work of Christ, particularly in the Old Testament. So both Testaments, Old and New, point directly to Christ, the Old anticipating, the New Testament explaining. He's going to take us through many of the fulfilled prophecies related to Christ, who, again, he's going to see as the central figure in all of redemption history. It is called a history of redemption, after all. And as he mentioned in his letter to the trustees in his own description of what he wanted this treatise to look like, it's going to have a tri-level universe of heaven, earth, and hell. So that simultaneously, he's talking about the realities going on in heaven, the realities going on down here on earth, and then the realities in the underworld as well, as he's weaving this all together around the person and work of Christ, with this major theme going back and forth throughout the whole of God and Christ and his kingdom versus the kingdom of Satan and his wicked and evil kingdom, which is going to be destroyed and undone as he goes forward throughout this series, okay? Now, like most of his sermons, this entire series does have a doctrinal statement. Remember, we mentioned the doctrine. And the doctrinal statements would usually be one line, one punctiliar statement, which Edwards would then unfold in a long series of subpoints and subheadings and so forth. Here, the thesis of the entire series, and probably would have been of the treatise had he lived to really write it out, is the work of redemption is a work that God carries on from the fall of man to the end of the world. Okay, so redemption, God redeeming or working to save, is something that God does, and he carries it on from the fall of man to the end of the world. In other words, there's that idea of the indestructibility of Christ's church over time. Now, when we think of the work of redemption, and I'm sorry, this is probably a little bit small on your screen here, Edwards is going to roughly work this out in biblical chronological order. Okay, so we are going to start with the decrees of God. These would be God declaring what is to be in his inter-Trinitarian Father, Son, and Holy Spirit decrees of what is going to eventually fall out in terms of real history here on planet Earth. He's going to begin with the decrees of God. He's going to look at creation, the fall of man, the giving of the law, the prophets. He's especially going to focus on Israel and its role in redemption economy, especially looking at the exile and the return to the Israelites. He gives that quite a bit of a large section in this book or sermon series. Focusing then on the incarnation of Christ, the giving of the Holy Spirit, church and evangelism as the gospel's carried out throughout the world. And then we're going to see him get really preoccupied with what he believes is the fall of Antichrist, or the collapse of the Roman Catholic Church. Remember, he's, as a Protestant and a Puritan, he's ardently anti-Catholic. And then he has a very optimistic view of history because he's a post-millennialist. So all of this is going to build and culminate as history builds towards the return of Christ and the eternal glory that is to follow after the millennium. Okay, so this is going to be the major thrust of how he's going to carry this out in his 30 sermons and then eventually in his treatise as well. Now, let's have a look at the sermons. And remember, this is all we have. The treatise was never fully finalized by Edwards. We're going to talk a little bit about that as we go. What we have is the 30 sermons that he was going to turn into this treatise. And so here's his arguments. He's going to start off in sermon number 1, a very important sermon. He's going to give the text and the doctrine. But the whole thing is going to function like one sermon almost, okay? He's going to introduce then the concept of redemption. And then he's going to split the work of God's redemption in history into 3 epochs or eras. Look at these right here. So the first epoch or era is going to be from the fall of man to the incarnation of Christ. In other words, that's the entire Old Testament, right? The fall to the incarnation. So this is going to take up sermons number 2 through 12 in the series, basically covering the Old Testament, with sermon number 13 really dialing in on application to the believer. Okay, so while this is very doctrinal and biblical and somewhat exegetical, he is going to have entire sermons where he's going to basically do the application throughout the series. And so that first big one is going to be sermon number 13, where he's really going to apply the fall of man to the incarnation, the whole Old Testament here. Then we're going to get into the second sweeping motion of redemption history in sermons 14 through 16, which is going to focus on the person of Christ here, again with an application sermon being sermon number 17, okay? And then in sermons 18 through 28, he's going to focus on from the resurrection to the end of the world. So you can see the 3 epochs from the fall to Christ, then we have the life of Christ, and then we have from the resurrection to the end of the world with an application sermon 29. And then in sermon 30, he's going to wrap it all up and show how God is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He is the focus of all of redemption history. Everything is to God's glory. Very much coinciding with what he says in his other treatise, The End for Which God Created the World, which likewise was published posthumously after Jonathan Edwards died, okay? He wrote it while he was alive, but it wasn't published till after he died, okay? So let's again look at these 3 epochs. Let me just go back to them real quick. So the fall to incarnation, then the resurrection to the end of the world. Let's look at each one of these epochs now. So from the fall to the incarnation, Edwards is going to break up the Old Testament into 6 sweeping movements. From the fall to the flood, from the flood to Abraham, Abraham to Moses, from Moses to David, David to the captivity, and then the captivity to Christ. Now that is a pretty good summary of the Old Testament. In fact, if you were trying to memorize kind of the flow of the Old Testament, that's not a bad way to do it. If you're a dispensationalist, you might even be seeing here something like a dispensational methodology, but please do not read that into Jonathan Edwards. That would be anachronistic to do so. Dispensationalism is not going to come around for another 100 years or so after Edwards has died. This is not sort of like a dispensational methodology here. It's just him breaking up the history of the Old Testament. Again, with what is the focus? The coming of the Christ. Okay, so Edwards, like a good Protestant Reformed exegete, sees the coming of Christ as the major reason why God is doing what God is doing in the Old Testament period. Okay, now, as it relates to that second sweeping movement, I think this is interesting here that he's going to focus on the birth, the life, and the death of Christ in that second sweeping section. But he's going to move the resurrection and the ascension to the third sweeping epoch. Now, if I was doing this myself, and again, I'm not, okay, so this is not my sermon series, this is Edwards' sermon series. But if I was going to do this myself, I probably would have included the resurrection and the ascension of Christ into the second sweeping epoch, because I think that it's hard to separate his birth, life, death, resurrection, and ascension, because that is the essential work of Christ, and all of these are necessary for redemption. But because Edwards wants to put the resurrection to the end of the world, then he's going to move this section here Again, I would have done it the other way. The resurrection, the ascension, he's going to move that later then to this third sweeping epoch from the resurrection to the end of the world. So here in Edwards' post-biblical history, and this is where it becomes interesting, we're going to go from resurrection to the destruction of the temple, which is prophesied in the New Testament, but happens after the completion of the writing of the New Testament, right? He's going to really dial in on the Christianization of Rome, and especially Constantine's conversion, which he thinks is very important. Then the rise and the fall of the papacy, which is an Edwardsian preoccupation for sure, with the anticipation of millennial glory. And we can see here then Edwards' post-millennialism coming into this third sweeping movement here. All right, so this would be his third epoch here. And this is where I think it's pretty interesting because it kind of becomes obvious here that Edwards is going to try to marry what we might call systematic theology, or probably more particularly biblical theology. He's going to marry that into church history. And this is why Edwards is going to say that it's going to be a wholly new form of doing systematic theology, because usually when we think of systematics or Reformed doctrine or dogmatics, we tend to put that in different classes than we put church history, right? But Edwards says, nah, can't do that. We're actually going to blend these two together. So church history is going to meld together with dogma or doctrine, so that it's going to be sort of a new casting of a way of doing Reformed doctrine. Okay, so that's what he's going to try to do here. Now, Edwards has some idiosyncrasies in his view of redemption history, for sure. For instance, as a historicist, he thinks the book of Revelation is basically a telling of history as well. Okay, so carrying up through his day and into the future. I'm more of an idealist myself, so I would disagree with some of Edwards' conjectures here, but Edwards believes that his own time, for instance, his own life, would properly be identified in the sixth seal of Revelation. Now, that's probably questionable, and I don't know how many people would believe that today, but perhaps some do, especially some that hold a historicist view as opposed to like an idealist view. Edwards also thinks that the whole of history is going to be about 7,000 years. So he thinks the whole of history from the creation to the end is going to be 6,000 plus the 1,000 of the millennial age, and that's going to bring us to a pretty even 7,000 years. Okay, so that's kind of an idiosyncratic view that I don't know how many of you out there watching this video would hold to. I don't hold to that, though I am a young earth creationist. I don't hold to that particularly. Edwards thinks of the revivals that they're experiencing, even that local revival in 1734, and he's going to see more of them later on in life. He thinks those are actually harbingers of that millennial dawn. And so for Edwards, this is all good news, because that means that the millennium might be coming soon. And so again, his post-millennialism is going to be worked out in sketch form in these sermons, okay? Now we might ask here, why didn't he finish this magnum opus then? What stopped him from writing this treatise? Well, he got interrupted again and again and again. So the first interruption that comes is the Great Awakening. Okay, now this is a welcome interruption for Edwards. He loves revival. He prays for revival. He waits for it all the time. He loves it. But as we know, he preached these sermons in 1739, but the revival starts, the big one, in 1740. So by the next year, 40, 41, 42, Whitfield's going to be sweeping through. Edwards is going to get so busy traveling, preaching, itinerating, writing, defending the revivals that he just gets bumped off of this major project. And unfortunately, again, after the revivals, he's going to get bumped off the project again, because after the awakenings and all of its carryings on and fallings out, the communion controversy is next going to take up his preoccupation, where he's basically defending his own job, which of course he loses, which is another deferral as he has to go on to Stockbridge. He has to take up the calling as a missionary Native American evangelist at Stockbridge, before then fending off challenges theologically with Arminianism. He's going to have to write his Freedom of the Will and his book on original sin. And so finally, as he's writing that letter to the trustees that we began with, he has every intention of filling out the sermon series, but what happens? He dies. 1758, Jonathan Edwards dies, and he never does take those 30 sermons and turn them into the masterpiece that he had hoped that they would become. Now, we do wonder what would have happened had Edwards lived to see the completion of this project. So let's just carry this out in theoretical ideation here. He says it would have been an entirely new form, a new way of doing a body of divinity. Now, a body of divinity in those days is what we would call a systematic theology or a theological treatise, something like, Thomas Watson calls his book on the first part of the Catechism, A Body of Divinity, and it's a very good book, by the way. And so what's entirely new about this, again, is the marriage of Reformed theology plus church history. And so this would be called what we would consider now biblical theology. So if you're familiar with like the works of Gerhardus Voss, for instance, Voss is kind of going to do what I think Jonathan Edwards probably would have wanted to do. So if you've ever read what is the name of it? Is it just called Biblical Theology? I'm blanking right now, but Gerhardus Voss's major work in which he does this very thing. He traces doctrine through biblical history. However, Voss does not carry that on into church history, post-biblical church history, as Edwards would have wanted to. So this would have been a huge work. And honestly, if we're just looking at this book right here, History of Redemption, Volume 9, it's already 500 pages with a long editor's introduction. But we can imagine what it would have been if Edwards had been able to sketch out the whole thing and really polish the treatise in the way that he wanted to. So what happened to it? Well, after Edwards dies, of course, his wife, Sarah Edwards, takes custody of all of his official papers, his letters, his drafts, his miscellanies, his sermons, all of that. But unfortunately, as you know, she dies not too terribly long after Edwards dies. So the manuscripts, she asks in her will for Hopkins and Bellamy, two of Edwards' good friends and proteges, to try to bring some of his stuff into publication, or at least be the custodian of his works. They're going to try. Okay, they're going to try to do some of that. Of course, they have their own works to work on and other controversies and their own church lives as pastors and so forth. So they're going to do okay. But the custody of this series of sermons is then going to fall to Jonathan Edwards Jr., who eventually is going to, we think, write these sermons out in a better, fuller form, because some of Edwards' manuscripts were, more or less extended outlines. And then he's going to send those on to John Erskine, who's going to then publish this posthumously after Edwards dies. So one of the things that makes this treatise, again, different, even if you have the one that I have right here, Volume 9, even if you've got that, or you're reading from edwards.yale.edu, keep in mind that what we have today has been mitigated through the hands of Jonathan Edwards Jr., who seems to have transcribed these sermons, probably put them into all one document, let's say, passes them then to Erskine, who's then going to prepare them for the press, and his editorial hand is kind of on this as well. So you see all kinds of fingerprints here. And so what we have today is probably not what Edwards would have wanted it to be, okay? So again, Jonathan Edwards Jr. transcribes from 12 notebooks to probably one document in easier hand to read. He's at least going to transcribe it in better handwriting. Edwards' handwriting is very, very small, hard to read. And then that transcription goes to John Erskine, who's going to do some substantial editing. We don't even know how much editing he really did. It's hard to say. But what we do have today has been mitigated then through Edwards Jr. and then John Erskine as well. Okay, so if we would ask what would have been, what could have been, had history worked its way out differently, we would have had Edwards' magnum opus, the work that he thought would have been his best one, and probably would have eclipsed Edwards' work, The Religious Affections and Freedom of the Will. These two works, as it stands now, are considered Edwards' best work. This probably would have eclipsed it in most people's estimation. And it might have, and this is my conjecture here, I'm only guessing, this might have become the standard Reformed textbook that seminarians would have trained on for a couple hundred years. As it stands, Edwards did not write a systematic theology or Reformed dogmatics or a church history. This is the best approximation of what he would have begun. But it might have, in my view, been the book that replaces Turretin as one of the primary texts, or Ames. Ames was also used quite a bit, but certainly Turretin, Calvin, obviously. Hodge is going to go on later at Princeton to write his 3-volume Reformed systematic theology. Herman Bavinck, the Dutch theologian, then Berkhoff is still a pretty standard text today. Edwards might have replaced all of those guys had he lived to see his work come to its conclusion, but sadly he did not. Okay, now before we leave you off today, I just want to mention to you one more time, and I've done this before, that if you're interested in my studies on Edwards, you might want to check out my book, A Theology of Joy, Jonathan Edwards, and Eternal Happiness in the Holy Trinity, as well as my book on his 70 resolutions, which he wrote when he was a young man. So both of these books you can find on Amazon.com. It'd be my honor if you would grab those. No pressure, though. Just want to let you know that that's out there. Okay? Well, once again, don't forget that over on my YouTube channel, there's just a ton of other videos on Jonathan Edwards. I've got all kinds of stuff on Edwards out there, so grab some of that stuff and educate yourself on one of the great theologians of all time, Jonathan Edwards. That's it for today. Thanks for checking in. Love you lots. Talk to you later.